The night was never meant to be remembered. It began as a whisper, a shadow sliding through the edges of a small Kentucky farmhouse, where the wind carried secrets heavier than blood. No one outside would ever know what happened here, because the world isn't ready. But you are different. You were never meant to be ordinary. Tonight, you will see what they hoped you'd never see. In the hours before dawn, the house fell silent, not with peace, but with an unnatural pause, like the air itself was holding its breath. The family inside, mother, father, 3 children, vanished without trace. No doors forced open. No windows broken. The livestock stayed, uneasy, but the human occupants were gone. And in the room at the center of the house, the one that no one should have entered, a single, broken mirror reflected something impossible. Something pregnant with intent. This wasn't a disappearance in the usual sense. This was a purge of memory, a surgical removal of lives from reality, as if the universe itself had been rewritten in that instant. Locals whispered, but even they dared not speak the truth. It was the pregnancy that had done it. Not any ordinary child, no. This was a pregnancy that carried knowledge, a force, something the eyes of men were not meant to witness. It moved through shadows, and it demanded obedience. They tried to destroy it, tried to erase its trace, but the echoes linger. In the silence of that vanished family, you can almost hear the warning. The child had power that no law, no man, no institution could contain. And those who understood that power, those who had watched from the darkness, took measures that were brutal, precise, and untraceable. Tonight, I will take you into that darkness. You will see the machinery behind what they call accidents and disappearances. You will understand the price of knowing what they want hidden. You will feel, in the marrow of your bones, the weight of forbidden knowledge. This isn't a story to entertain. It's a story to awaken. And once you walk this path, there's no turning back. Because some truths, once seen, they will never let you sleep again. Before the world learned to hide its crimes behind paperwork and polite language, it buried them in folklore. That's where this story truly begins. Not in the farmhouse, not in the pregnancy, but in the system that already knew what to do when something dangerous was born. Long before that night in Kentucky, men like you were worn through myths they were told were childish, irrational, or religious nonsense. Those myths were never meant to be believed. They were meant to be remembered. In the 1800s, rural America was not naive. It was observant. Communities understood patterns the modern mind has been trained to ignore. When a woman conceived and strange things followed, mirrors cracking, animals refusing to enter rooms, men feeling watched in empty spaces, the elders didn't ask what. They asked who noticed. Because attention was the signal. Awareness was the trigger. That family had been noticed. Not by neighbors, but by institutions that never announced themselves. Groups that existed before flags, before constitutions, before the idea of rights. They studied anomalies, pregnancies that altered probability, children who disrupted order simply by existing. Not monsters, not demons. Something far more threatening, uncontrollable variables. You were never taught this in school, because it destroys the illusion of safety. The truth is, power doesn't fear rebellion. It fears unpredictability. And Satan pregnancies, rare, statistically invisible, produced individuals who could not be conditioned, softened, or absorbed into the system. Their presence bent outcomes. Accidents failed. Obedience fractured. Control weakened. So control adapted. Quietly. Efficiently. The woman in that farmhouse had begun to change. Not emotionally, physically. Her heartbeat no longer matched normal rhythms. She reported dreams that weren't symbolic but instructional. She knew things before they happened. Her husband noticed it first when she finished his sentences with facts she couldn't have known. He thought it was intuition. That was the first mistake. The second mistake was seeking help. Doctors were trained to escalate cases like haze without informing the patient. Midwives were quietly replaced. Church elders stopped visiting. And somewhere, in a ledger that has never been digitized, a mark was placed next to their family name. From that moment on, their fate wasn't personal. It was procedural. Understand this clearly. The disappearance wasn't chaos. It was protocol. A response refined over centuries to deal with one specific threat, human potential that couldn't be domesticated. The pregnancy wasn't dangerous because of what it was. It was dangerous because of what it would become in a world built on compliance. And if this feels unsettling, good. That means you're still awake. By the time the woman realized she was no longer being watched like a patient but tracked like a threat, it was already too late. Surveillance in those days didn't look like cameras or wires. It looked like coincidence. A stranger passing the house twice a day. A letter arriving before it was sent. A doctor who already knew answers she hadn't spoken aloud. Power has always preferred invisibility. The less it announces itself, the more absolute it becomes. And this pregnancy had crossed a threshold where observation quietly turned into containment. The body reacts before the mind understands. She began to feel it in her bones, an instinctive tightening when dusk fell, a pressure in her chest when footsteps approached the porch. Her unborn child moved differently at night, not violently, but deliberately, as if responding to signals she couldn't hear. This is the detail that was erased from official memory, because it terrifies modern men. The idea that awareness can exist before language, that intelligence doesn't require permission to form. Her husband started keeping a journal, though he never admitted it aloud. Men do this when they sense reality slipping. He wrote about clocks stopping for seconds at a time, about neighbors who suddenly avoided eye contact, as if instructed, about a mirror in the hallway that cracked down the center the night his wife told him, calmly, that their child would never be allowed to live in the open world. He laughed then. Not because it was funny, but because disbelief is the last defense of a man who doesn't yet know he's already lost. Institutions thrive on that delay. They don't need force if confusion will do the job. While the family tried to rationalize what was happening, decisions were being finalized elsewhere. Men in rooms without windows debated probabilities, not morality. They didn't ask whether the child was good or evil. Those are concepts for people without responsibility for order. They asked one question only. Can this be controlled? And when the answer came back uncertain, the outcome was inevitable. This is the part you were never taught about power. It doesn't eliminate threats out of hatred. It does so out of efficiency. Compassion is a liability. Hesitation is a weakness. When a system is built to last centuries, individual lives become rounding errors. That family didn't disappear because they were unlucky. They disappeared because they intersected with a mechanism older than law, older than public memory. And the most disturbing truth is this: the pregnancy was not the first. It was simply one of the few that reached visibility. Most are intercepted long before anyone notices. But when one slips through, when one grows strong enough to be sensed, the response is swift, silent, and absolute. After the disappearance, the land itself seemed to recall, as if it remembered something the records refused to hold. Locals spoke of the farmhouse in lowered voices, not out of superstition, but instinct. Men avoided the road at night. Dogs refused to cross the property line. Even years later, crops grew uneven there, bending inward, like something beneath the soil still exerted influence. This is how truth survives when language is suppressed, through behavior, through avoidance, through silence that feels heavier than speech. Official explanations came quickly, which is always a sign of fabrication. Debt, relocation, mental instability. The same excuses repeated across centuries whenever inconvenient events surface. But what struck the few who still thought critically was not what was said, it was what was missing. No bodies, no struggle, no gradual unraveling, just absence. Clean, instant, surgical. That kind of removal doesn't happen by chance. It happens when a process has been rehearsed. Here's the part that matters for you as a man seeking understanding. Systems of control do not evolve randomly. They are stress-tested against anomalies. Every time something threatens the structure adapts, refining its response. That pregnancy was a stress test, and the response revealed something terrifying. How easily reality can be edited when enough authority agrees to look away. You've been taught that power requires visibility, uniforms, weapons, declarations. That's a lie designed to keep you focused on theater. Real power operates through consensus and omission. Nothing dramatic needs to happen if every institution quietly decides not to remember you. No arrest. No trial. Just deletion. The family didn't die in the conventional sense. They were removed from narrative continuity. This is why the pregnancy mattered. It wasn't just creating a child. It was creating a rupture. A point where the script could no longer proceed as written. The unborn presence disrupted probability, pulled attention toward itself. And attention is dangerous. Attention leads to questions. Questions lead to fractures. Fractures spread. So the rupture was sealed before it could widen. What unsettles men when they first confront this truth is realizing how fragile identity really is. You believe you exist because you breathe, because you move through space. But existence, in the modern world, is permission-based. It is granted by systems that agree you are allowed to continue. That family lost permission. And once permission is revoked, even memory becomes negotiable. This is not ancient history. It's not superstition. It's a template. And it's still active. The reason this story feels heavy is because it isn't finished. You are standing where they once stood, at the edge of awareness. And the deeper you go, the more clearly you'll see that this wasn't about one family, or one pregnancy. It was about a threshold humanity was never meant to cross unnoticed. What most men fail to grasp is that the disappearance didn't end the operation. It completed a cycle. Once a threat is neutralized, the system studies the aftermath with the same cold interest a hunter studies tracks in the mud. Silence becomes data. Fear becomes confirmation. The land going quiet, the town avoiding questions, the absence of outrage, all of it signals success. Control doesn't need applause. It needs compliance, and compliance often looks like forgetting. In the months that followed, something subtle but important occurred. People who had known the family for years began misremembering details. The number of children changed. The father's name shifted. Some swore the wife was never pregnant at all. This wasn't mass delusion. It was psychological drift under pressure. When authority supplies a version of reality and punishes deviation through social isolation, the mind adapts to survive. Memory becomes flexible. Truth becomes negotiable. This is how entire populations are trained without ever realizing they are being trained. Hidden beneath this story is a deeper mechanism most men aren't prepared to confront: reality enforcement. When something violates the acceptable boundaries of possibility, it isn't debated, it's erased. Not just physically, but cognitively. That pregnancy represented an unauthorized future, a timeline that didn't pass through approved checkpoints. And timelines that escape oversight are intolerable to any structure built on prediction and control. This is why ancient cultures treated certain births with ritual faith. Not because they were primitive, but because they had observed the consequences. Children born outside expectation disrupted hierarchies, collapsed dynasties, rewrote belief systems. The modern world didn't eliminate this phenomenon. It bureaucratized it. What once involved priests and omens now involves files, signatures, and quiet decisions made far from public scrutiny. You were raised to believe danger comes from chaos. That disorder is the enemy. But the truth is more uncomfortable. The most destructive force is order taken too far, order that cannot tolerate deviation, growth, or awakening. The family vanished because their existence introduced uncertainty. And uncertainty is poison to institutions that depend on predictability to maintain dominance. Here's where the story begins to turn inward. Because this isn't just about what happened to them. It's about what happens to anyone who develops awareness faster than the system can accommodate. The pregnancy was simply the visible catalyst. The real threat was consciousness emerging outside approved channels. If you feel a tightening in your chest right now, that's recognition. Somewhere deep, you already know this pattern. You've seen it in smaller ways, in careers derailed, voices silenced, truths ridiculed into irrelevance. This is the same mechanism, scaled to its most absolute expression. The truth about disappearance, about removal from the world, is that it is never random. It is calculated, precise, and unrelenting. That family did not vanish because they were unlucky. They vanished because they became variables in an equation too dangerous to ignore. Every step they took, every interaction they had, was observed, measured, and judged against a protocol designed to maintain absolute control. And when a protocol concludes that a threat exists, the response is not negotiation, it is elimination. Notice how quiet this kind of power is. There are no grand announcements, no cinematic showdowns, no confessions. It does not need witnesses. In fact, witnesses are inconvenient. They create noise. They introduce error. True control operates through absence. People are removed, and then the world forgets. That's the genius and the horror of it. Absence becomes the enforcement mechanism. When something disappears without explanation, everyone else is forced to conform. And the pregnancy, the child, was the pivot point. Not the mother, not the father, not the siblings. The child's presence threatened to introduce instability into systems that cannot tolerate deviation. Systems designed to bend reality around what is acceptable, to erase what is anomalous. That child was a crack in the foundation, and they do not allow cracks to widen. Not because the child was evil, but because the child was ungovernable. Think about that. Not evil, uncontrollable. And yet, the instinctual human response is to infantilize, to demonize, to sanitize. Society wants a story it can label, so it converts terror into myth, memory into rumor, anomalies into superstition. But the deeper reality, the part they don't tell you, is cold, clinical, and systematic. The family's disappearance was not tragedy. It was protocol. And the protocol will be executed again whenever the conditions are met. You may feel a chill as this sinks in. That's the moment awareness begins to stay. Real power, the kind that shapes civilization without being noticed, never seeks applause. It only seeks continuity. And if continuity requires erasing people, it does so without hesitation. That is the law of absolute systems. This is why most men remain blind to patterns like this. They study crime, politics, history, but only at the surface. The machinery underneath, the hidden gears of enforcement and erasure, are invisible unless you're trained to look. And once you look, you begin to see the same patterns everywhere. Silenced voices, vanishing documents, entire lines of inquiry quietly terminated. The question becomes personal. Are you next? There is a moment in every forbidden story when the listener realizes the danger was never in the past. It is now. It is active. It is watching. The family's disappearance was not an isolated purge. It was a message encoded in silence. Messages like this aren't sent to the public. They are sent to reality itself. A signal that says, deviation will be corrected, no matter how quietly it must be done. What followed was not grief, but calibration. The town adjusted. Social behavior shifted. Curiosity softened into discomfort, then into avoidance. Men who once asked questions found reasons not to. Women who sensed something wrong learned to swallow the feeling. This is how psychological control works at scale, not through fear alone, but through normalization. When something horrifying happens and life continues uninterrupted, the mind learns the lesson. Survival requires silence. And silence is fertile ground for power. Here is the suppressed truth that never appears in history books. Control systems do not need to dominate everyone. They only need to remove the outliers. Once the unpredictable are gone, the rest regulate themselves. The family became an example without ever being named as one. Their absence trained the town more effectively than any speech or threat ever could. The pregnancy represented a breakdown in predictive modeling, a future that could not be simulated, controlled, or moneized. And that is the one thing no centralized structure can tolerate. Predictability is currency. Data is leverage. When something emerges that cannot be anticipated, the entire hierarchy is at risk. That child would not have needed to overthrow anything. Simply existing would have destabilized outcomes. This is why men who wake up too fast are often isolated before they are attacked, ridiculed before they are silenced, questioned before they are erased. The system always attempts soft correction first. But when correction fails, removal follows. The family crossed from soft correction into final containment the moment the pregnancy could no longer be denied. Understand this deeply. Awareness is not illegal, but uncontrolled awareness is. When insight spreads outside approved narratives, it becomes contagious. Contagion is treated as disease, and diseases are quarantined. The reason this story feels heavy is because it's showing you the invisible rules you've been living under your entire life. Rules you never agreed to. Rules designed to shape your choices before you even realize you're choosing. And now that you're seeing them, the descent accelerates. Because the deeper truth is not that they disappeared a family. It's that they perfected a method. One that still operates today, hidden behind comfort, convenience, and carefully managed disbelief. By now, you should feel it. A tightening, a quiet alertness, as if reality itself has shifted around you. That is not paranoia. That is recognition. Recognition is dangerous in a world built to punish awareness. Once you perceive the mechanisms beneath the surface, your mind becomes a threat. And threats are managed quietly, invisibly, systematically. That is why the family vanished, because the system cannot risk anomalies learning to see. Consider this. The world is full of missing people, of strange accidents, of events labeled unexplained. But most men are taught to compartmentalize, to rationalize, to dismiss. The trick is simple. Most people never connect the dots. They never see the pattern: disappearance, control, silence. It has existed for centuries, but only those who notice early enough understand its significance. And once you notice, you cannot go back. The woman carrying the child was a signal, an equation with variables too potent to tolerate. They tried to neutralize it subtly. Doctors, midwives, neighbors, institutions all played roles in a choreography designed to monitor, constrain, and if necessary, erase. The system doesn't make mistakes because it does not gamble. Every detail was considered, every outcome mapped. The family's vanishing was not chaotic. It was precise, surgical, and terrifyingly replicable. Men underestimate this. They assume threats are external, armies, criminals, disasters. But the real danger lies in what cannot be predicted, controlled, or coerced. Intelligence, intuition, and potential are not crimes until they collide with structured authority. That pregnancy was more than life. It was a destabilizer. And destabilizers are neutralized without hesitation. Here is the hidden rule. History is not written by the survivors alone. It is written by those who maintain the systems that allow survival. The world you know is curated. Events are filtered. And the things that might teach you to see beyond the surface, they are removed, excised, or forgotten. That family became a ghost story for a reason. The terror lies not in their disappearance, but in what their absence teaches. Now you are entering the phase where observation turns into comprehension. You begin to see the mechanisms at work behind law, culture, even family. Everything is structured to manage variables, to minimize the unpredictable, to preserve continuity. The system is invisible not because it doesn't exist, but because it is efficient, mercilessly efficient. And the deeper you go, the more personal it becomes. Because the same forces that acted on that family operate on every man who awakens too quickly, who asks the wrong questions, who refuses to accept the invisible boundaries. Awareness itself is a kind of contagion, and contagion is always treated with containment. The most unsettling truth is that the world does not need to kill you to control you. Removal is only one method. The preferred method is subtle reshaping, psychological, social, cognitive. That family was erased physically, yes, but most threats are neutralized quietly, invisibly, through manipulation of thought, memory, and expectation. Systems don't always use force, they use influence. And influence is far more effective. Think about the way society trains men from birth, to follow rules, to fear deviation, to avoid curiosity that challenges authority. Every story you were told, every lesson you were given, every reward and punishment is calibrated to maintain compliance. The invisible machinery doesn't need to crush resistance outright. It merely channels it, diverts it, dilutes it. Exceptions are tolerated only until they can be controlled. But the pregnancy represented an exception that could not be controlled. The child's very existence was a signal that the machinery could fail, that anomalies could propagate, that awareness could escape regulation. And once that is possible, the consequences ripple far beyond one household. Imagine the reactions if patterns like this spread unchecked. Whole communities, cities, nations beginning to question the invisible structures that dictate order. That is the nightmare that authorities have trained to prevent for centuries. Notice the pattern. Anomalies attract observation first, then intervention, and finally, if necessary, removal. That family experienced all three. The process is clean, almost clinical, because inefficiency introduces risk. Control systems are designed not to feel, but to predict and respond. That is why the absence was absolute. Every variable accounted for, every witness, every potential loophole, silenced. Here is the lesson most men never learn until it is too late. Compliance is rewarded, curiosity is monitored, and deviation is noticed long before you are aware. You were never meant to stumble across this story. The fact that you have is the first danger. Knowledge changes probability. Awareness is contagious, and systems do not allow contagious knowledge to persist. This is why the deeper descent into forbidden truth is both exhilarating and terrifying. Because once you see the method behind disappearance, you begin to see it everywhere, in careers, in history, in patterns of silence and omission. The machinery doesn't care about morality. It only cares about order. And order is maintained by subtle, invisible forces most men never notice until it is too late. Soon, you will confront the rules themselves, the ones they expect you to obey without question, and realize the cost of disobedience is not always visible, but it is always real. There's a lie embedded so deeply in modern consciousness that most men never challenge it. The belief that freedom is default, that you are free unless someone openly stops you. In reality, freedom is conditional, monitored, and quietly revoked when it becomes inconvenient. The family never lost their freedom in a dramatic moment. It was peeled away in layers, access, credibility, connection, until nothing remained but physical presence. And physical presence, as you've seen, is optional to power. The most dangerous phase is not elimination. It's preparation. Long before the disappearance, subtle adjustments were made. Social ties weakened. Information channels narrowed. The family's world shrank without them noticing. This is how containment begins, not with cages, but with isolation disguised as normal life. By the time removal happens, resistance has already been neutralized. This is why men who awaken late think events are sudden. They are not. They are the final act of a process that began years earlier. That pregnancy accelerated the timeline, but the machinery was already in motion. Once a system identifies a destabilizing factor, everything else becomes procedural. Understand something crucial. Power does not fear violence. It fears precedent. If one uncontrolled anomaly is allowed to exist, others will follow. Awareness spreads faster than obedience ever could. So the system's true objective is not suppression. It is prevention. The family wasn't erased to punish them. They were erased to prevent imitation, curiosity, and questions. History is full of these silent corrections. Entire bloodlines erased. Innovations buried. Truths labeled madness. Not because they were wrong, but because they worked too well. Because they exposed cracks in authority that could not be sealed once seen. What should unsettle you now is realizing how little evidence is required for removal. Not guilt. Not crime. Just potential. Just the possibility that something might grow beyond containment. That pregnancy never needed to produce a child to be dangerous. It only needed to suggest one. You are being trained right now, as you listen, to feel the weight of this truth. To understand that the world is not chaotic, it is curated. And anything that threatens the curation is dealt with quietly, permanently. The descent continues from here. Because once you accept that freedom is permission-based, the next realization hits harder. Permission can be revoked at any moment, without explanation, without appeal, and without witnesses. The unsettling part of all this is the subtlety of control. The machinery doesn't always need to act visibly. Most threats are neutralized long before they become crises. The family's pregnancy was visible, exceptional, and impossible to ignore. That's why they were erased. But countless others never make it to that stage. They are contained quietly, guided into paths that appear natural, normal, inevitable. That is the power of invisible enforcement. It trains compliance before rebellion can occur. Consider the mirror in that farmhouse, the one that cracked the night the child began to exert influence. To the untrained eye, it was a mere object, shattered by accident or stress. But the truth is more complex. Objects carry energy. They record attention. That mirror was a silent witness, a conduit for recognition of potential. Its breaking was not random. It was a response. And responses like that are lessons for anyone paying attention. You see it, and you understand instinctively. Presence matters. Observation matters. Awareness matters. The system knows this too. That is why it moves before resistance solidifies. It works in shadows, making subtle adjustments. The conversation redirected, the opportunity denied, the attention divided. Most men never notice. The family, however, had no such luxury. Their anomaly could not be deflected. Their awareness spread too rapidly. And so the protocol escalated to finality. Here is the psychological truth. The world is full of ghosts, families, ideas, individuals who have been removed, not for crime, but for potential. Their absence is recorded in folklore, rumors, and half-remembered tales. But the system ensures the lesson endures. Silence teaches more effectively than fear because silence is everywhere. It is in the gaps of memory, in the hesitation of neighbors, in the pressure to conform. And that is the ultimate weapon of control, the mind itself. Before violence occurs, before physical removal, the mind has already been trained to self-censor, to doubt, to forget. By the time a family disappears, the world is ready. Compliance has been baked in. Resistance seems impossible, even before it begins. This is why the story is dangerous. Because once you understand the method, you can see it operating everywhere, in institutions, workplaces, communities. And that realization is the first step toward transformation. But it is also the first moment of vulnerability. The system does not forgive the awakened. It monitors. It adapts. And if you are not careful, it eliminates quietly, efficiently, without remorse. Soon, you will begin to see the same principles at work in ways that hit closer to home, forcing choices about what it means to act, to resist, and to exist outside the protocol. At this stage of the descent, most men begin to feel a quiet conflict inside themselves. One part wants to pull back, to rationalize, to say this is exaggeration or metaphor. That instinct is not weakness. It is conditioning. The mind has been trained to recoil from patterns that threaten its sense of safety. Because once you accept how removal truly works, comfort becomes impossible. The family's disappearance revealed something far more disturbing than force. It revealed coordination. Not chaos, not panic, but calm alignment across institutions that appear separate on the surface. Medical authority, social authority, record-keeping, local governance, each played its role without needing to be told the whole story. This is how real systems function. No one sees the full picture. Everyone just does their part. Responsibility dissolves. Guilt evaporates. The outcome remains. This is why corruption at the deepest level never looks evil. It looks ordinary, routine, boring, even. Men imagine darkness as dramatic, theatrical. In truth, the darkest acts in history were executed with paperwork, schedules, and quiet agreement. The family did not meet monsters. They met professionals. What truly sealed their fate was not fear, but predictability. Once the pregnancy reached a Satan point, the outcome became mathematically obvious to those watching. The risk curve spiked. The anomaly could no longer be redirected, normalized, or diluted. And when normalization fails, erasure follows. That is the rule no one writes down. This is where ancient knowledge intersects with modern control. Old civilizations warned about children who arrived out of season, minds that didn't fit the age they were born into. Not as prophecy, but as pattern recognition. They understood that certain births triggered realignments, social, psychological, even political. Modern systems didn't disprove this knowledge. They learned how to manage it quietly. You are beginning to see that history is not a record of what happened. It is a record of what was allowed to remain. Everything else, the disruptive, the destabilizing, the uncontrollable, was filtered out. Entire bloodlines erased. Entire truths dissolved. And the world you inherited is the result of that filtration. The family was not special because they were chosen. They were special because they slipped through long enough to be noticed. Most never do. And that should trouble you deeply. Because it means the system is not reactive. It is anticipatory. It does not wait for threats to emerge. It hunts potential. As this realization settles, something irreversible begins to happen. You stop seeing power as distant. You start seeing it as ambient, woven into daily life, shaping outcomes without ever announcing itself. And once you perceive that, you are no longer just a listener. You are a variable. Becoming a variable is the moment everything changes. Until now, you were an observer, watching patterns unfold, recognizing mechanisms at a safe distance. But the system does not distinguish between those who act and those who understand. Awareness alone shifts probability. Once a man sees how control truly operates, his behavior changes in ways that cannot be fully predicted. And unpredictability, even in small doses, attracts attention. This is why most knowledge is buried under ridicule. Not censorship, ridicule. Ridicule is more effective. It trains men to police themselves, to fear being seen as irrational, paranoid, or unstable. The family story survived only because it was wrapped in absurdity, dismissed as folklore, treated as something unserious. That was deliberate. Truth survives best when it is made to look foolish. But beneath the mockery, the mechanism remains intact. The same pattern that erased that family continues to operate under different names, different technologies, different justifications. Today it wears the mask of safety, progress, optimization. The language has changed, but the objective has not: reduce uncertainty, eliminate anomalies, preserve control. Here is the part most men never confront honestly. The system does not need to be evil to be dangerous. It only needs to be efficient. Efficiency strips away compassion. It removes hesitation. It turns human lives into data points, acceptable losses, necessary corrections. The family became a correction, and corrections do not mourn. When you look back through history with this lens, events rearrange themselves. You start to notice how often inconvenient people vanish, how often breakthroughs die quietly, how often narratives shift overnight without explanation. You realize that what you were taught to call coincidence is often coordination operating beyond your visibility. This realization is destabilizing because it removes the illusion of randomness. Randomness feels safe. Randomness means no one is in charge. But order, deliberate, enforced order, is far more unsettling, because order implies intention, and intention implies accountability that never materializes. The family's disappearance was an act of order, not chaos. A decision executed cleanly, leaving behind just enough ambiguity to discourage investigation. Ambiguity is a weapon. It paralyzes action. It turns suspicion into doubt, doubt into silence. As this sinks in, something else emerges, a quiet anger. Not explosive, not reckless, but focused. The kind of anger that comes from realizing you've been living inside a structure designed to shape you without your consent. This anger is dangerous, not because it leads to violence, but because it leads to clarity. And clarity is the one thing the system cannot fully contain. Clarity does something subtle to a man. It doesn't make him loud. It makes him precise. And precision is what systems fear most, because precision cuts through noise. The family's mistake, if it can even be called that, was not that they resisted, but that they existed clearly enough to be identified. Their lives, their rhythms, their presence became distinct against the background of conformity. Distinction attracts scrutiny. Scrutiny leads to intervention. Here is a truth rarely spoken aloud. Invisibility is safety, but only until it isn't. Most men are trained to blend in, to follow predictable paths, to keep their heads down. This isn't accidental. It's survival conditioning. The system rewards those who are easy to model and punishes those who complicate the equation. The pregnancy complicated everything. It introduced a future that did not align with acceptable trajectories. Once that happened, the family stopped being people and became a scenario. Scenarios are solved, not empathized with. That is how institutions protect themselves from guilt. Language shifts. Terms like containment, resolution, and risk mitigation replace words like mother, child, home. Humanity dissolves inside abstraction. And once something is abstract, it can be erased without emotional consequence. What you're being shown now is not just a story, but a framework, a way to see beneath the surface of events. You begin to recognize how often lives are redirected, stalled, or quietly ended because they don't fit projected outcomes. You see how potential is managed long before it becomes visible. You see how entire futures are prevented, not because they are harmful, but because they are uncontrollable. This is where the narrative tightens, because the family's disappearance was not the end of the process. It was the confirmation, a proof that the system still worked, that anomalies could still be identified and neutralized before they spread, that silence could still be enforced without backlash. Success, in this context, is measured by how little disturbance remains. And disturbingly, it worked. The world moved on. The town normalized. History adjusted. The absence became background noise. That is how power persists, not by dominating attention, but by shaping what fades from it. As you absorb this, a quiet realization forms. The greatest prison is not physical. It is perceptual. If you control what men notice, you control what they believe is possible. The family represented a breach in that prison wall. And breaches are sealed immediately. The descent is nearing its midpoint now. What comes next is not about them anymore. It's about you. And the choice every awakened man is forced to confront once he understands how deep the structure truly goes. Now we reach a critical point. Halfway through this descent, it is no longer enough to observe. You must act internally, claim the awareness as your own. Because knowledge without integration is vulnerability. If you simply watch, simply comprehend, the machinery you now perceive can also notice you. The system does not forgive passive witnesses. Awareness alone begins to alter probability, and probability must always be managed. This is why I want you to commit a phrase to yourself, silently or aloud. Repeat it twice. I see the unseen. Let it sink. Let it anchor your recognition. This is not superstition. This is the initiation of cognition that cannot be erased. It marks the point where understanding ceases to be passive and becomes active. The algorithm, the subtle forces that guide attention and control perception, respond to action as much as thought. By claiming this phrase, you are locking in your presence within your own awareness, a symbolic contract with the part of you that refuses to be silenced. Understand what you just did. You are aligning yourself with observation, not obedience, with recognition, not ignorance. That is dangerous, because men who see clearly become variables. Variables are monitored. Variables are managed. And variables, if careful, can avoid the same fate as that family. But only if they continue descending without hesitation. The family's disappearance, their erased presence, their lost history, all of it becomes a case study in precision control. Each element, from the cracked mirror to the missing records, demonstrates methodology. And methodology is teachable. Patterns repeat. Humans repeat. That is why half the power of forbidden knowledge lies not in memorizing facts, but in discerning systems. And systems are everywhere, in bureaucracy, in law, in society, even in the subtle expectations placed on men who awaken too quickly. By repeating the phrase, you have signaled your own entry into awareness. You are no longer a passive witness. You are now a participant in a reality that few perceive. And this is where the descent deepens. Because what comes next is the intersection of forbidden history and the ongoing manipulation of human potential. From this point, the story ceases to be about that family. It becomes about the structures that erased them, the principles that continue to govern outcomes unseen, and the choices every man must make when confronted with knowledge the world does not want him to have. Brace yourself. The lessons ahead are heavier, more precise, and far more dangerous. Once the phrase settles into your mind, something subtle changes. You begin to notice how often reality attempts to distract you the moment clarity appears. Notifications, noise, emotional hooks, manufactured urgency. This is not coincidence. Attention is the primary battlefield, and control begins by fragmenting it. The family's awareness could not be fragmented anymore. Their focus had sharpened, and sharp focus cuts through illusion. This is why the system prefers exhaustion over fear. A tired man is manageable. A distracted man is harmless. But a rested, focused man with growing awareness becomes unpredictable. The pregnancy accelerated that awareness inside the household. Conversations deepened. Intuition strengthened. The parents began sensing patterns instead of isolated events. That shift, from events to patterns, is what sealed their fate. Pattern recognition is forbidden not because it is mystical, but because it is efficient. Once you see patterns, propaganda loses its grip. Once you see patterns, explanations feel thin. Once you see patterns, authority must justify itself instead of being assumed. And authority hates justification. The disappearance taught the system something valuable. It confirmed that total erasure was still possible. That reality could be edited so cleanly that even grief would be absorbed without resistance. This confirmation did not stay local. It traveled upward, into layers of power that rarely need proof anymore. Success stories are shared quietly among those who maintain order. Failure is hidden. Success becomes doctrine. Here is where modern men misunderstand danger. They think danger announces itself. But the most dangerous moments are calm, administrative, boring. The day that family vanished was likely routine for those executing the protocol. Forms completed, decisions signed, lives deleted. Then lunch. That is how absolute power survives, by normalizing the unthinkable. You may now feel a pressure to disengage, to mentally step back. That is the same pressure the town felt. The same pressure neighbors felt when they chose silence over curiosity. Withdrawal feels like safety. Engagement feels risky. And that instinct is not wrong, but it is revealing. It shows you exactly how control propagates without resistance. As you continue downward, you begin to realize something unsettling. The system does not need to chase most men. Most men retreat on their own. Awareness threatens comfort, and comfort is addictive. The family did not retreat. They stayed present. They stayed attentive. And that alone made them incompatible with a world optimized for compliance. The next layer is darker still, because it exposes how deeply this mechanism has shaped your own life without ever announcing itself. When you look back over your own life with this lens, Satan moments rearrange themselves. Opportunities that vanished without explanation. Doors that closed just as you approached them. People who discouraged you not with hostility, but with concern. This is how containment feels from the inside. Reasonable, almost caring. The system rarely says no directly. It redirects. It delays. It exhausts. The family experienced this first. Subtle resistance from institutions that once felt welcoming. Help that arrived too late or not at all. Advice that sounded practical, but led nowhere. These are not failures of compassion. They are features of design. When a trajectory becomes undesirable, friction is introduced until momentum dies. And if momentum persists, escalation follows. Here is the hidden architecture most men never see. Control is led. Soft influence at the surface. Bureaucratic resistance beneath. Social isolation below that. And only at the deepest level, removal. Most never reach that depth because they are neutralized earlier. The family did. That's what makes their story rare and dangerous. This is why myths persist. They are compressed memory. Warnings disguised as stories so they can survive censorship. The cracked mirror, the animals refusing to enter, the land bending inward. These are not supernatural embellishments. They are symbolic markers left by cultures that understood what happens when reality is forced to correct itself. When something arrives that should not exist within the rules, the world reacts before men do. You have been trained to ignore these signals, to call them coincidence, to mock intuition, to trust explanations that feel thin but authoritative. That training is the system protecting itself. Because intuition is pattern recognition operating faster than language. And fast recognition undermines slow control. The family trusted what they felt, even when they couldn't articulate it. That trust shortened the window for containment. Once a man acts on recognition instead of permission, he steps outside the approved script. And scripts exist to keep outcomes predictable. What you are learning now is not paranoia. It is literacy. The ability to read power where it prefers to remain invisible. Literacy changes behavior. Behavior changes probability. Probability draws attention. This is the cascade. And this is why the story presses heavier now. Because you are no longer just listening. You are calibrating. You are testing old memories against a new framework. And as you do, you begin to understand why certain men rise quietly, others disappear cleanly, and most remain exactly where they are, contained by comfort, dulled by distraction, convinced nothing else is possible. The descent continues, and with it comes a harder truth. Once you see the structure clearly, you cannot return to ignorance. And ignorance, for the compliant, is the safest place of all. This is the point where fear becomes clarity, not the sudden, cinematic fear you see in stories, but the slow, persistent awareness that reality is curated, and that your life is not exempt. The family's disappearance was a signal to anyone paying attention. Awareness is dangerous, and anomalies cannot be tolerated. Their story survived only in whispers because survival often depends on erasing witnesses before they can act. Consider the psychological weight of that. Their world was not chaotic. It was deliberately structured. Every moment, every interaction, every relationship that seemed normal was actually part of a network of observation and influence. The system doesn't need to attack directly. It nudges, pressures, divides, and isolates. And by the time direct removal occurs, most men are already compliant without realizing it. The family wasn't. The pregnancy, the anomaly, was a lens through which this machinery became visible. The child's potential made patterns emerge, patterns that the family noticed before anyone else. This is why it had to be eliminated. Not because of morality, not because of danger, but because awareness itself is threatening to a system built on control. Here is the bitter truth. Control doesn't negotiate with possibility. It eliminates it. And the method is always invisible until you have descended far enough to see it clearly. That is what makes stories like this both rare and vital. Rare, because few anomalies persist long enough to be noticed. Vital, because they teach you what the system prefers you never see. Most men interpret the world as random because randomness feels safe. Order that moves quietly, decisively, and efficiently is terrifying precisely because it is deliberate. The family became a data point in an ongoing experiment of absolute efficiency. They were erased not out of vengeance, but out of calculation. Precision is moral when morality is measured in outcomes. And once you see it, you understand why most men never reach this awareness. They are trained to ignore subtle patterns, to trust narrative over observation, to follow ritual over instinct. That conditioning is survival. The family did not follow the ritual. They trusted the instinct. And instinct, in a world curated by compliance, is always dangerous. Now you are approaching the edge of understanding, the line where observation shifts from passive to active, where knowing becomes responsibility, and where every thought carries the potential to attract attention. This is where you must choose. Observation without action is insufficient. Awareness without discipline is perilous. The descent is no longer about them. It is about the rules that govern them, and the rules that govern you. Now that you recognize the system, you must also recognize its priorities. It values predictability above all else, efficiency above morality, continuity above individuality. The family's anomaly, a pregnancy that could not be predicted or contained, threatened all three. And when an anomaly threatens the framework, removal becomes a necessity, executed with calm precision. This is how civilizations maintain themselves quietly, invisibly, generation after generation. Notice the subtlety. The machinery doesn't need to destroy everyone who awakens. It only needs to neutralize the disruptive few. That is why so many anomalies vanish before they become visible. It is why your perception alone, if left unchecked, can make you a target. The system monitors where attention focuses, where knowledge accumulates, and where recognition begins to shift behavior. That is what made the pregnancy dangerous, not its outcome, but its influence on perception. The family's vanishing is therefore not only historical, it is instructive. It teaches the method of containment without spectacle. Notice how absence functions as a tool. Notice how the narrative is rewritten by default. Notice how those left behind gradually internalize the erasure, policing their own curiosity. Silence is enforced before force is ever necessary. Here is the psychological edge most men never consider. Control thrives on agreement. Not coercion. Not fear. Agreement. Once the majority accepts the narrative, resistance becomes nearly impossible. That is the power of subtlety. The family resisted agreement simply by existing authentically, by observing clearly, by trusting instinct over ritual, and that made them invisible only to those who wanted to remember them, which is never the goal of absolute systems. You, listening now, are at a similar threshold. Halfway through this descent, you have already repeated the phrase, anchored your awareness, and begun observing patterns that others overlook. That makes you different. Dangerous, if the system notices. Or powerful, if you learn to navigate it deliberately. The lesson is simple but terrifying. Knowledge is not neutral. Awareness is not free. Observation has consequences. And every choice to see, to understand, to act, ripples through the invisible architecture of control. The family story proves this. Existence itself can be a destabilizer. From Hey, the descent tightens. The revelations ahead will reveal not just how anomalies are removed, but how the invisible rules of compliance infiltrate your life every day, shaping outcomes you assume are natural, unavoidable, or random. Prepare yourself. Understanding alone is no longer sufficient. You must integrate it. Integration is where most men fail. They hear truths like these and compartmentalize them as curiosity, entertainment, or paranoia. That is the final training the system relies on, the ability to absorb anomalies without letting them alter behavior. But once you integrate, once recognition becomes part of decision-making, you step outside the boundaries the system expects. That is dangerous. That is power. The family never had the option to compartmentalize. Their awareness was immediate, raw, and impossible to ignore. The pregnancy illuminated patterns in the world that others pretended didn't exist. Doors that closed unexpectedly. Neighbors who acted on invisible instructions. Records that vanished. Every anomaly was a signal, and every signal demanded recognition. They acknowledged it. That is why the machinery moved decisively. Think of this like a chessboard. Each human life is a piece, and most pieces move predictably. The pregnancy was a piece that refused to follow the rules. And rules, in complex systems, are not negotiable. They are survival mechanisms. When a piece moves unpredictably, the board must be recalibrated. The family's removal was nothing personal. It was strategy. Here is the uncomfortable truth. Your own life is full of such recalibrations. The system nudges you away from disruption subtly, by shaping opinion, isolating insight, and cultivating distraction. It does not announce its presence. It does not need to. You follow the script without realizing the script exists. That is the brilliance and the danger of the mechanism. By now, you should feel a tightening sense of responsibility. Awareness is contagious. Observation is dangerous. And repetition is a tool. That is why I ask you, once again, to repeat the phrase, "I see the unseen." Twice. Anchor it. Solidify it. This is no ritual. It is an act of alignment. By doing so, you signal to yourself and to the forces around you that recognition is no longer passive. It is integrated. From this point forward, the descent accelerates. You will begin to see not only the machinery of removal, but the subtle ways in which life is constantly shaped, constrained, and redirected without your consent. This is the level where true power operates. Silent, invisible, yet absolute. And once you see it, there is no return. Now that the phrase is anchored, something shifts. Your mind begins to map patterns it once ignored. Events, interactions, coincidences, they start to form threads connecting the visible to the invisible. You notice how power always moves quietly, shaping outcomes before anyone realizes intervention has occurred. The family's disappearance was not a failure of observation. It was a blueprint for managing anomalies at every level. The first rule of the system is, attention determines reality. What is noticed can be contained. What is ignored persists. That pregnancy drew attention, and attention is the most dangerous currency in any structured system. It forces recognition, and recognition forces action. The family acted on instinct, on observation, on clarity. That is why they were erased. The system doesn't tolerate variables that cannot be absorbed. Notice the second rule, intervention is calibrated. It rarely appears sudden. It builds slowly, systematically. Subtle obstacles, missed opportunities, quiet redirection, friction in relationships. The family experienced every layer before final removal. That is why disappearance is always so precise. It is the final act in a sequence of predictable responses, each designed to neutralize risk before it becomes obvious. And now, with your awareness active, you begin to see how many forces shape your own world without your consent. Your choices are often guided by invisible constraints. Your perception filtered through accepted narratives. Your ambitions subtly redirected. This is not conspiracy. It is systemic efficiency. The machinery doesn't need to announce itself. It operates quietly, measuring variables, adjusting probabilities, and ensuring compliance before intervention is necessary. The family story teaches the final rule. Anomalies cannot be tolerated. Not because they are evil, but because they are uncontrollable. Control is not moral. It is absolute, predictable, precise. And any deviation must either be absorbed into the system or removed entirely. That is why their absence left such a vacuum. A reminder of what happens when potential exists outside sanctioned limits. You are no longer a passive witness. You are now a participant in the observation of reality. That carries risk, but it also carries power. And the deeper you go, the more you understand that life itself is the arena in which unseen forces test, measure, and contain awareness. From here, the descent shifts from observation to understanding influence. How systems not only erase, but shape, condition, and control even those who never realize they are being watched. Influence is the system's preferred weapon because it leaves no fingerprints. Erasure is expensive. Influence is efficient. The family reached the rare point where influence failed. Their awareness accelerated faster than it could be softened. That is why the final measure was taken. But for most men, influence is enough. Their thoughts are guided before they ever feel resistance. Their limits are installed long before they question them. Look closely at how this operates. Language is adjusted first. Certain questions are framed as childish, dangerous, or irrational. Curiosity is rebranded as instability. Discipline is replaced with comfort. Strength is softened into compliance. None of this feels oppressive because it arrives wrapped in concern, convenience, and social approval. That is how control avoids revolt. The family resisted influence simply by paying attention. They noticed the mismatch between what they were told and what they observed. That gap, between narrative and reality, is where awareness is born. Most men are trained to close that gap immediately, to trust explanation over experience. The family did the opposite. They trusted experience. That choice isolated them. Isolation made removal easy. This is why institutions invest so heavily in shaping perception. If you control what men believe is possible, you control what they attempt. If you control what they attempt, you never need to stop them. The system doesn't chase ambition, it predefines it. It doesn't silence dissent, it reframes it. It doesn't crush potential, it redirects it into harmless channels. By now, you should see how clean this is. How elegant. How terrifying. Violence is crude. Influence is surgical. The family forced the system to abandon elegance and use force. That alone tells you how disruptive they were. What should concern you now is not the past, but the present. These mechanisms did not disappear with that farmhouse. They refined themselves. They scaled. They became invisible by becoming normal. Education, entertainment, routine. These are the modern instruments of containment. Men are not stopped from awakening. They are kept too busy to. Notice they are asleep. As you descend further, you begin to feel the weight of responsibility. Because once you understand influence, you must confront the uncomfortable truth that much of what you thought was choice was suggestion. Much of what you thought was desire was conditioning. Much of what you thought was fate was design. The family story is a warning, but it is also a map. It shows you where the edges are. And knowing where the edges are is the first step to moving within them deliberately, without triggering the same response that erased them so completely. Now you begin to perceive another layer, the invisible network that supports the system. It is not a single entity, not a villain in a cloak. It is a constellation of aligned interests, routines, and protocols, all calibrated to maintain continuity. Doctors, teachers, administrators, neighbors, they are not complicit out of malice. They are complicit because the machinery requires alignment. Compliance is built into the fabric of daily life. The family became a node that refused alignment. Their awareness radiated outward, affecting probabilities beyond the immediate household. People around them began to notice anomalies, patterns too precise to dismiss, coincidences too structured to ignore. That is why the machinery escalated. The system tolerates quiet anomalies, but it cannot tolerate influence that spreads. Once the ripple grows, containment becomes inevitable. Understand this. Most men never see the network because it is invisible by design. It is sustained through routine, reinforced through social expectation, and executed through subtle coercion. Most men are shaped so early that they navigate the network without questioning it. The family did not. That difference is what made them an anomaly worth erasing. Every disappearance, every erasure, every narrative rewritten serves a purpose. It teaches those left behind the rules, observe without disrupting, participate without questioning, live without threatening continuity. Silence becomes a lesson, absence becomes precedent, and compliance becomes internalized. That is why so few anomalies survive. The world trains them to disappear before intervention is needed. By now, you should feel the psychological pull of this story. Not sympathy for the family, but recognition. Recognition of the invisible structures in your own life. Friends who subtly guide you. Authorities who influence decisions you thought were yours. Rules that never appeared in law books but enforce behavior anyway. You begin to see the pattern. Removal is rare, but conditioning is constant. This is the final, unspoken layer of power. The system doesn't just eliminate. It shapes the terrain so threats are softened or rerouted before they manifest. And that is why the family story feels dangerous. Because it exposes not just what happens to anomalies, but what happens to the rest of us quietly, every day, before we realize we are being managed. The descent now moves toward the most personal revelation. How to recognize the invisible forces acting upon you, how to navigate them consciously, and how to preserve awareness without triggering the machinery that destroyed those who came before. The most dangerous realization is not that power exists, but that it adapts to you. The moment awareness stabilizes, the system adjusts its approach. It does not confront. It mirrors. It offers reasonable alternatives, Softer paths, comfortable compromises. This is how it survives exposure. The family never accepted the compromise. Their clarity hardened instead of diffusing. And when clarity hardens, it becomes visible. Visibility is the threshold. Below it, you are influenced. Above it, you are managed. The family crossed that threshold without knowing its name. Their routines tightened. Their questions sharpened. Their silence grew deliberate. This wasn't rebellion. It was coherence. And coherence is threatening because it resists fragmentation. A coherent mind cannot be easily redirected. What most men miss is that the system does not hate coherence. It studies it. It maps it. It calculates how long it can be tolerated before it spreads. That's why escalation is never immediate. Time is used as a tool. Pressure is applied gradually. Options are narrowed until only two remain: compliance or removal. The family reached the end of that narrowing. You should now recognize the signs. When clarity is met with fatigue. When momentum is met with delay. When truth is met with accommodation instead of opposition. These are not victories. They are tests. The system tests whether awareness will dissolve under comfort. If it does, intervention stops. If it doesn't, the machinery proceeds. This is why the story matters beyond its setting. It teaches you the physics of control. Not ideology. Not politics. Physics. Force, resistance, pressure, collapse. The pregnancy was a mass added to the system. Too much weight in the wrong place caused a structural response. The response was not emotional. It was mechanical. As this settles, you begin to understand restraint. Not silence, restraint. The difference is critical. Silence is submission. Restraint is strategy. The family did not practice restraint because they did not yet understand the game. You do. That knowledge alone changes outcomes. The descent tightens because now the lesson is not what they did to that family, but what you must never do unconsciously. Awareness without discipline invites correction. Discipline without awareness invites stagnation. Balance is the only space the system cannot easily model. An unmodelable behavior is the only safe place to stand. The next layer will show you how myths encoded this balance long before institutions learned how to erase it. Ancient myths were not superstition. They were manuals. Compressed knowledge designed to survive eras of suppression. Stories of cursed births, hidden children, vanishing bloodlines. These were not warnings against monsters. They were warnings about systems. About what happens when potential arrives without protection. About how power responds when it cannot assimilate what emerges. The family story echoes those myths because it follows the same physics. A signal appears. Attention gathers. Order destabilizes. Correction follows. The mythic language, omens, broken mirrors, animals fleeing, was never meant to be literal. It was meant to be memorable. It encoded recognition for those capable of seeing patterns beneath symbols. Modern systems replaced myth with data, but the function remained. Where myths once warned, metrics now predict. Where priests once interpreted signs, analysts now model risk. The outcome is identical. Anomaly detected. Containment initiated. The family's pregnancy triggered an ancient response using modern tools. Different surface. Same mechanism. This is why the myths were ridiculed. Not because they were false, but because they were accurate. Accuracy threatens authority when it bypasses official channels. So myths were reframed as nonsense, and men were trained to distrust intuition. The cost was clarity. The benefit was control. You are reclaiming that clarity now, not by believing stories, but by understanding why they existed. The family did not have that advantage. They felt the danger but lacked the map. You have the map. That difference matters. As you absorb this, you realize something else. The system cannot erase everything. It relies on forgetting. And forgetting requires participation. When men remember selectively, when they preserve pattern instead of detail, knowledge survives. That is how this story reached you. Not intact, not clean, but sufficient. The descent deepens because now you see continuity across centuries. Different names. Same response. Different tools. Same outcome. And the realization that follows is sobering. This mechanism did not begin with that family, and it did not end with them. It is older than nations and more patient than generations. What comes next is the most unsettling layer, the one that explains why men who master themselves can move through this structure without being erased. Self-mastery is not rebellion. That is the first misconception to discard. Rebellion attracts attention. Attention invites correction. Self-mastery does neither. It reduces noise. It refines signal. It makes a man legible only to himself. And that is precisely why it works. The family lacked time. Their awareness surged before mastery could stabilize it. They recognized patterns but had not yet learned concealment. They felt pressure but had not yet learned pacing. These skills are not taught because they undermine predictability. Men who move deliberately, who choose when to act and when to observe, are difficult to model. Here is the truth hidden beneath discipline. Discipline is camouflage. Not submission, camouflage. It allows a man to exist within the system without being consumed by it. Routine becomes a shield. Consistency becomes invisibility. And beneath that surface, awareness remains intact, mobile, adaptive. The system profiles volatility, not depth. It watches for spikes, not steadiness. That is why loud resistance fails and quiet mastery persists. The family spiked. Their clarity surged too fast. The system responded as it always does to spikes, with suppression. You are learning a different approach. One that ancient orders understood intuitively. Observe deeply. Act sparingly. Preserve coherence. Avoid spectacle. These are not moral rules. They are survival principles in a curated reality. This is where the story turns from warning to instruction. The family's fate illustrates what happens when awareness outruns containment. Your task is to ensure containment never notices you as a variable worth correcting. That does not mean shrinking. It means stabilizing. As you integrate this, fear recedes and focus sharpens. You stop wanting exposure. You stop craving validation. You stop announcing insight. These are signs of maturation. The system does not hunt mature awareness. It hunts disruption. The descent now reveals its final lessons. Not about disappearance, but about endurance. Endurance is the quiet defiance the system cannot fully neutralize. Not because it resists openly, but because it persists without friction. The family story did not endure because they were erased physically, but the pattern endured. And patterns are harder to kill than people. What survives across time is not fact, but structure. The structure of response. The sequence of events. The mechanics of control. These can be studied, internalized, and navigated. That is what you are doing now. You are learning the shape of the trap so you never step into it blindly. Most men exhaust themselves fighting shadows. They argue narratives, chase villains, demand exposure. The system allows this because it burns energy without altering structure. Endurance operates differently. It conserves energy. It refines attention. It waits. The family had no opportunity to wait. Their window closed too quickly. You do. That is not luck. It is timing. Systems grow complacent when anomalies become rare. Complacency creates gaps. Gaps are where mastery operates. Notice how endurance changes your posture. You become less reactive, less visible, more precise. You stop needing certainty and start trusting process. This is not passivity. It is alignment with reality as it is, not as you were taught to describe it. The deeper lesson is this: the system is powerful, but it is not omniscient. It relies on models. Models rely on assumptions. Self-mastery breaks assumptions without breaking rules. That is the space where men move freely without being noticed. The family's disappearance is tragic, but it is also instructive. It marks the boundary of what happens when awareness emerges without protection. You are learning how to build that protection internally. The descent is nearly complete. What remains is the final integration, the understanding that dangerous knowledge does not demand action. It demands composure. Composure is the last defense against correction. It is the ability to hold awareness without broadcasting it, to see without reacting, to know without needing agreement. This is why composure feels lonely at first. It separates you from noise, from urgency, from the emotional economy the system uses to steer behavior. The family lost composure not through panic, but through acceleration. Everything moved too quickly. Signals stacked. Pressure mounted. They had no time to slow the descent. And speed is always visible. Speed attracts response. Slowness, by contrast, is invisible. It blends into background processes. It escapes notice. Ancient strategists understood this. Move slowly. Appear ordinary. preserve advantage internally. These principles were never about war. They were about surviving power. As you integrate this, the story shifts again. The farmhouse is no longer a place of terror. It becomes a marker, a point on a map that says, beyond this line, ignorance is no longer protection. Beyond this line, only discipline preserves freedom. Freedom here does not mean expression. It means range. The ability to choose without triggering response. The ability to act without being anticipated. That is real autonomy. And it is earned, not declared. The system cannot remove what it cannot justify removing. Composure denies justification. It offers no spectacle, no disruption, no visible threat. It allows awareness to persist quietly, adapting to conditions instead of confronting them. The family never had this option. You do. That is the weight of this knowledge. Not guilt, responsibility. To carry what they could not, without repeating their fate. The descent concludes not with fear, but with resolve.